Good evening, everyone. My name is Esther Anani. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a faculty member and the director of the School of Disability Studies. It's my pleasure to be with you here tonight and to welcome you as audience members and welcome the panelists to be here together for critical dialogue and reflection. I'm bringing greetings from my colleagues in the School of Disability Studies, Dr. Eliza Chandler, Dr. Lauren Monroe, Dr. Virki Varghese, and some new members of our school, Dr. Andrew McEwen and Margot Shalburn. Some of them are in the audience, and we're all very proud of our colleague, Dr. Idil Abdillahi, as she launches us in this academic year in a panel that is Black Oculars, that is so relevant to our school. For those of you who don't know, the School of Disability Studies offers an undergraduate program leading to a Bachelor of Arts. It's a degree completion program. Students attend it from a distance, part-time, online, and they're often working at the same time. They're often students who are incredibly disenfranchised in relation to the kinds of institutions that the Black Oculars series will take up. They have found themselves in the past the object of surveillance, and they find themselves on the front lines as workers carrying out the surveillance work of the state. So this panel is incredibly, crucially important for our students in enabling them to think critically about their lives and their bodies and the kind of work that they do. Disability studies is often about thinking about equity and justice for disabled, mad, and deaf people. It's often very affirmative. We want to think about disability, madness, and deafhood as desirable and in its most affirmative ways. But many times we have to look to our minds and bodies to start as a site for critical reflection about surveillance, about containment and confinement, and about how we can resist publicly and privately. The work that we're going to see today and in the series is funded by Dr. Abdillahi's Social Sciences and Humanities Connections grant. So Idil, you can follow convention when needed. This builds on a body of work that can be builds on Idil's body of work that we can see in some of her recently published work, including Black Women and the State, Black Life, and her forthcoming book, Blackened Madness. Today's panel is an opportunity for us to be together for critical reflection and for dialogue, to work across our different positions as academics, activists, artists, whether we're on the panel or we're in the audience, to think about the topics that this panel highlights. So I'm looking forward to it, and I'm very pleased to hand it over to you, Idil.
Thank you so much, Esther, and thank you, Kiris, as well. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm just going to briefly mute my camera while I read. So again, welcome everyone to the first session of the Black Ocular Speaker Series, a monthly speaker series on Blackness, gender, and new surveillance technologies in so-called Canada. Again, my name is Idil Abdillahi, and I'm the convener of this series, as well as an assistant professor in the School of Disability Studies at Toronto Metropolitan University. Before we begin, I would like to I would like to go over a few access notes. If you'd like to access our live caption, please click the CC button. There are a few ways that you can participate in tonight's panel. Feel free to use the chat box to ask questions directly to panelists and to chat with your fellow attendees. Please note that the chat box is automatically set to send messages only to panelists. If you would like everyone to see your remarks, please click the arrow next to the button and click all panelists and attendees before you send your text. If in the Q&A portion of the panel you would like to speak using audio, please press the raise hand function and we will enable your microphone at the appropriate time. If you need video on for your questions, please message the hosts in the chat. Also, Zoom webinars have a question and answer feature. To use this feature, please press the question and answer button and type the questions into the Q&A box and click send. So you can also choose to send your questions anonymously by clicking on the box below and typing in the area. And we can also reply to your questions live or in the text window. It took tremendous effort to bring this series together, and we would not have been able to bring it to fruition without the collective work of our phenomenal team of students, staff, research assistants. I'd like to first extend my deep gratitude to Tally, who is the School of Disability Studies Disability Publics Lab Coordinator, Apollo, Amber, and Maddie, who are working behind the scenes. Again, thank you to my colleagues in the School of Disability Studies for supporting this project, the Faculty of Community and Social Services for providing funding support, and to SSHRC for the overall funding of this series. I'd also like to thank this evening's speakers, Camisha, Elle, and Bev, as well as our media services team who's providing tech support, Luke, and most importantly, our access team, the ASL interpreters, David and Rana, the deaf interpreters, Courage and Sylvie, and thank you, of course, for their flexibility. It's been a challenge with our accessibility. Also, thank you to our live captioner, Angie, as well. Now I'd like to speak a bit more about the series in general. Black Oculars is a speaker series that brings together researchers, artists, frontline practitioners, and community members to propose knowledge exchange and dissemination. This forum will advance interdisciplinary and community-oriented and historically grounded understandings of Black women and non-binary people's experiences with policing and other institutions that function to both surveil and control our lives. In particular, this series places emphasis on histories of policing and surveillance, technologies of surveillance in healthcare and public policy, and responses from deaf, disabled, MAD, queer, and trans Black people. In addition, the series will bring forth and reveal the ways in which systems of control are exacted in everyday realities of public life. This series will generate a more critical understanding of anti-Black gendered impacts of policing and institutional surveillance practices, as well as pathways for short-term and systemic change. The first panel, Policing Ecologies, Lessons from the Plantation and Beyond, explores the interconnectedness of colonialism at the intersection of policing and public life as they impact the lives of Afro-Indigenous and Black women and Black Indigenous women and non-binary people. The focus of this panel is to look at the continuum and contemporary iterations of police and colonial logics as they manifest in highly imbalanced, highly imbalanced power structures. I'm looking forward to welcoming Camisha, Elle, and Bev to tonight's discussion, and I know that we will have a generative conversation. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Camisha Sibblis. Professor Camisha Sibblis is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and the Associate Director of Training and Education and Institutional Strategic Initiatives at the University of Toronto, Mississauga as well. She's the co-investigator of a SSHRC Connections funded project entitled Sealing the Leaky Pipe, Constructions of Mentorship Best Practices for Racialized Graduate Students in the Academy. She's the recipient of the MyTax Acceleration Grant with the YMCA as the agency collaborator and a collaborator on the SSHRC Insight Development Grant, quote, Schools, Safety, and Urban Neighborhoods. Her research uses spatial, temporal, and race theories to focus on anti-Black racism, carcerality in Black life, and other politics of intersectionality. She wrote the Morris Report, the first impact on race and culture assessment report applied in criminal sentencing of Black offenders in Ontario. Professor Sibblis has also been a mental health practitioner as well as a clinical agent for the Office of the Children's Lawyer. In 2022, Professor Sibblis was named one of Canada's top 100 Black women to watch for by the Canadian International Black Women of Excellence. So let's please welcome Camisha Sibblis, and we're really looking forward to your talk and discussion that follows.
Hi, ready?
Yes, Camisha, go ahead.
I want to start by just thanking you, Idil, for inviting me and women like me to come and speak, and for actually giving me permission to just talk. I spoke to you today and you said, you don't have to have a talk prepared, and I don't. I just want to be able to speak really, ironically, about things I don't know, right? So I want to thank my esteemed colleagues on the panel and in the audience as well. I'm here with some dope women, so I consider myself a hype man. So I'm just going to talk. It's alphabet soup, right? So stop me whenever you're ready. So my talk was going to be called Representing Black Women's Work with Social, that hyphenated, right? And I want to talk a little bit about the field of social work and what it does to us. So the field of social work has undergone several transmogrifications, beginning with white women's charity and continuing to become a pseudo profession and academic discipline, ostensibly concerned with social justice and the redistribution of power. Throughout and despite these shifts in ideology over time, social work has held steadfast to its raced and racist, classed and classist, deeply gendered roots. More recently, the bid to be a respected contender in the arenas of traditionally recognized professions, such as law, medicine, and education, has social work desperately betraying the values it espouses in order to become more legible and more relevant to its counterparts. And really, it is about being it's about being more masculinized, right? So that it can be respected. So, notwithstanding, the field remains at the bottom of the professional hierarchy, lacking both respect and prestige because of its feminization, its relative novelty, its humanitarian ethos, and its hypocritical relationship with capitalism, simultaneously with its denouncement of capitalism, right? And so I am acutely aware of how social work not only polices bodies like me, my body itself, but also uses me to police others. And that really is the focus of my pedagogy. So I want to use myself to illustrate what happens to Black women social workers who labor there as well as in other fields. So you'll just indulge me for a little bit. I am a critical social worker whose academic work to date has been centered on, race and identity, youth criminalization and marginalization, carcerality, and the spatiality of exclusion and education. And my goal in my social work and in academics is to raise consciousness in an unrelenting pursuit of social justice for the purposes of promoting and sustaining Black life. I see my research as part of a broader effort across disciplines to study identity, oppression, and anti-oppressive alternatives. So my research was inspired, and I'm talking about my research because it's very related to our lessons from the plantation and carcerality, was with working with the suspension and expulsion programs with youth involved in the criminal justice system, examining the vestiges of chattel slavery and the impact on academic and the social trajectory of Black Canadian males. So it interrogated the expansion of the Black prison inmate population and the sanctions that allowed for the targeting of such bodies by the criminal justice system, and the connections to these to school expulsion programs, as well as the historical mapping of containment with respect to these bodies, our bodies, and the bodies of our sons, brothers, fathers. It's a racial and spatial analysis of expulsion programs, but a larger social expulsion, right? And it centers the subjugated knowledges of academic excluded Black youth, arguing that in addition to establishing a direct path from the schools to prisons, these programs are carceral spaces that situate the prison inside of the school. So what I talk about on a broader scope is the ubiquity of carcerality in Black life, right? So Idil spoke a little bit about some of the things that I've done, but I want to just sort of briefly outline some of these things again to make a point, because I said I'm going to speak about all the things that I don't know. So I was born and raised in Canada, interfaced with various social systems quite intimately as a social service user. I was a teenage mom. I'm a first generation Canadian Black woman, mother of 2 boys and a girl. I worked within and at the interstices of major social institutions. I worked in child welfare as a child protection worker. I worked for One Vision, One Voice, a ministry-funded program addressing the overrepresentation of Black people within child welfare. As Idil mentioned, I worked with family law as a clinical agent for the Office of the Children's Lawyer. I'm also in the criminal justice arena writing the race and culture assessments, or enhanced pre-sentence reports, as they're now called, and writing the first one for a Black male in Ontario, and leading to it being called the Sibblis report or the Morris report for him. And these are like Laju reports for Indigenous peoples. They're akin to them, although we can't say that they're alike because of the histories. So I've taught post-secondary. I've worked in the public school system, and I've taught in social work, sociology, child and youth work, and social service work. And I've worked both in mainstream and alternative programs in the mainstream system. So like I take with me very multiple locations that inform my activism, my practice, my teaching, and my research. And still, with all that, I'm not an expert. I'm not a knower. I'm a laborer. And so this is the way that I embody the plantation legacy, right? This is the carceral legacy for me. As we know, racism is about trust or lack thereof, and being out of place. And I'm out of place in all of these arenas unless I am the service user, unless I am the learner, unless I'm the laborer. I am not the knower. So moving from the front line of social justice to an academic, and what that means has been interesting for me, right? Because academia imagines itself to be a neutral and objective space with only self-interest at its core, right? And so it causes a lot of academic tensions for me because I'm out of place here, right? I am not the white male who has the luxury of sitting around and pondering for countless hours, days, months, years, as a knowledge creator. And so I'm not known as a knower. So the first of some of these tensions surfaced as at my PhD comprehensive exams, when I was accused of being a social worker rather than an academic, because I introduced emotion and conscience to my knowledge, to my work, right? And so I'm taught that these ontologies are anti-academic, right? And so knowing that the institution doesn't walk the talk has been difficult, right? Knowing that, I'm sorry, I'm reacting to some of the faces I'm seeing and the reactions, but I've been told, you know, in a prolonged journey for my PhD by one of my supervisors, a white woman, that I'm not taking the process seriously, being that I have been the breadwinner of my family, being a single mother of 3 children with ADHD, being a Black woman, having gone through everything that I've had to go through, because it's taken longer and because I've had to work full time to attain all of my degrees, I've not taken the process seriously. And so my work, and so when I look back at these things, it's that I'm unable to produce in the ways or in the spheres that I've worked so hard to produce, right? I've listed out all those things, and the Black women on here know that we hustle for basic recognition and still don't get that. In my time at the board, being a social worker, despite the fact that I've been trained in social justice. I've been trained in these frameworks. When they decided that they were going to start taking a look at Black folks and the fact that Black children are suffering and are underperforming, right, or underachieving in schools, they didn't call on us or any other Black social worker. They had the teachers, right? So they had the teachers teach around anti-Black racism, around anti-bias awareness training. And so I'm unable to do anti-racist education, planning, admin, right? And instead we have teachers running a huge organization with no business skills and little management experience or skill, right? And so I can't be a knower in that sphere. I also can't be a knower in or an unbiased expert with my Black knowledge. So when I go into the court as an expert witness, I have to prove my expertise, and it still gets challenged. So I was prepped for one of my court appearances by a Black lawyer, a Black woman lawyer, right? And this is how we end up policing each other. And I met her, and I was dressed up when we met. I had bright lipstick on, and she said, "Don't wear that bright lipstick in the courtroom. Tone down that look. Wear glasses if you have them, so that I can look smarter, right? And I can be more palatable, right?" And so, you can wear glasses, right? How about these? How's that going to play out, right? So yeah, these are cute and trendy for my white counterparts, but outlandish and off-putting for me, right? So in the classroom, students want to tell me how to teach and are constantly trying to expose my certain delegitimacy and leverage irrational fear against me. I've been reported for texting in class when I was actually putting my timer on for their activity. My non-Black colleagues can actually text in class without being reported because it's assumed that they're doing something legitimate. right? It is always assumed that I'm being delinquent. I've been reported for triggering them with videos of people sharing videos of Indigenous folks sharing their stories of residential schools, right? And so the policing happens from above and below. Students are policing me constantly in the fields. So, and then when I call that to the attention of who might be my superiors, to other peers, to people who are tasked with addressing maybe anti-racism within these institutions, I don't even get to be the expert about whether or not I've been assailed against at work, right? I get asked questions, are you sure it was racist? Are you sure that was the intention? So, you know, we're faced with the age-old dichotomy between the knowers and the doers, right? The doers can't be knowers, the laborers are not thinkers, objects are not subjects, and we've not moved past that. So there's also, you know, I can talk about stories about when I was a child protection worker, and what, you know, I had was used to, people would profile the young mothers in the hospitals. There'd be a specific nurse that called religiously when there was a young Black mother going into labor, right? And you know, I'm sent out to basically harass this woman, and she's done nothing wrong but be young and decide to have a baby and be Black. And so, you know, the policing just and the carcerality of our lives, it's just really pervasive. And I don't know, Idil, if you want to jump in at any point and ask anything about it, or.
Thank you so much, actually, Camisha. You've highlighted so many critical points and taken us through some really important things to consider, especially around discussions regarding policing and so forth. What happens when we, you know, call on intervention of certain kinds of professions and practitioners that ultimately also seek to carry out the same kinds of policing functions. You also really, for me, I think we're able to express all the ways in which, while we may be speaking about Black women and non-binary people, to some degree, the conversation is still very much centered around men and boys. So really for us to think about all the ways in which Black women and Black people appear in those stories, right? Appear in those narratives and what happens throughout that process. And finally, your own personal experience around being a service user and sort of transitioning throughout your roles, and what it means to be, what it means to know or to not know in all of these different kind of iterations of your life. So thank you so much, Camisha, for all of your comments.
I wanted to just add, because you said, you know, despite the fact that we're speaking about women, that how men sort of get centered in some of this work. Ironically, one of my experiences was with my dissertation, having it sent back only to add my male supervisor's work all over it, right? That he basically demanded that I add his work in so that he can be cited everywhere, and invariably take some sort of credit for some of the things that I was saying. And so, you know, the erasure is extremely also very ubiquitous.
Yes, thank you for highlighting that. Wow, we can hopefully get into some more of that as we go through the discussion. Thank you for that, Camisha. I want to go ahead now and welcome our second speaker, Dr. Elle Jones. Elle Jones is a poet, a journalist, an assistant professor in political and Canadian studies at Mount St. Vincent University, and a community advocate living in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She was the 5th Poet Laureate of Halifax and the 2015 resident of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. Elle was the poet in residence at the University of Toronto Scarborough in 2021. She won 2 Atlantic Journalism Gold Awards in 2018 and 19. In 2016, Elle was the recipient of the Burnley Rocky Jones Human Rights Award. She was also the 15th Nancy Chair in Women's Studies at Mount St. Vincent University. Elle was the lead author of the report, Defunding the Police, Defining the Way Forward for HRM. Her second book, Abolitionist Intimacies, a collection of poetry, prose, examining abolition through feminist practice of care and resistance, is being released by Fernwood Press this November. And just really quickly, because I have it here, you probably can't see it, so there's no point of sharing it, but please read the book. So with that, Elle, I want to go ahead and welcome you.
Thank you so much, Idil. And we're really grateful to Dr. Abdillahi for bringing us here today, and particularly for the way that her work on the child welfare system really opens up a new way of thinking about criminalization and surveillance, as well as Black women in particular. So we're so grateful for that work. I'm going to just connect a lot of various points, or maybe not connect them, leave them hanging out there. The first thing I wanted to say, especially something that stood out in the previous talk, was the connection between surveillance and erasure. And I think that came across so beautifully, that surveillance is used as a means of erasing Black women. And of course, this is the old kind of conundrum between we are both invisible and hypervisible as Black people. But I really like this connection that these modes of surveillance, particularly with the academy, are enacted upon us so that we can be pushed out and disappeared. And I thought that came across beautifully. I was also thinking about this title, Ocularity, and thinking about the eye and how often that has been a physical site of monitoring for Black people, beginning with the idea that, eyes and teeth are frequently cited upon particularly darker skinned Black people as this way that makes one's body become dehumanized, right? So that the eye in itself, even just the possession of one as a Black person, has been used in all these ways to dehumanize Black people. And then of course, the reverse gaze of that. And finally, just in my preliminary overarching thoughts, I think it's clear that surveillance is a gendered practice, but one that hides those origins of being gendered and masks that in a kind of universality, whether that's in the way that, for example, a male body surveyed, a Black male body often becomes hypermasculinized to the point that it almost feminizes, right? So we can think of Mike Brown being, seen as this kind of monstered King Kong figure that is so, out of control and so threatening that he therefore must be killed, in other words, emasculated. And then the ways that these gendered practices of surveillance particularly are enacted upon Black women. Some practical examples are, of course, things like facial recognition technologies that misidentify Black women specifically at extremely high rates. So we can think of those practical things, as well as the very notion of who is watched and gazed upon, who is entered and violated by that, which becomes in a patriarchal settler colonial society, a very feminizing act as well, to be looked upon. Women as coded as feminine are there to be looked at. And one other practice I'll cite in this kind of train of thought is the notions of monitoring bracelets, for example, which are becoming more and more common in both the criminal justice system and the crimmigration system, which are largely, of course, funded by the Black women who support men. And I've made the kind of ironic joke of how many crimes have to be committed in order for people to pay for these bracelets that are supposed to be keeping people safe, which isn't really a joke, right? But these kind of burdens, particularly now of actually having to pay for community-based surveillance that falls upon largely the labor of women in order to produce bracelets and pay for them, that are then used in particular to monitor Black men who are then seen as threats to the nation or to the neighborhood or to the so-called public. So I just wanted to put all of that out here. Just to start with some personal thoughts, and I thank Camisha for being vulnerable and open in her experiences. Just some of my own experiences. So last week, the right-wing tabloid named Frank Magazine folded in Halifax. This is a tabloid that invested many years in surveying me, like virtually publishing my address, everything short of following me around to public events, taking photos of me walking on the streets, showing up at events only to tweet about me, like at the Journalism Awards, coming to my, infiltrating Zooms, taking personal posts off my social media. All of those things would happen repeatedly, and largely happened because of my position as a Black woman who spoke about policing. Ironically, they were able to reconstitute themselves in their latter stages through the reporting on Portapeak, which is of course the mass shooting in Nova Scotia, where they were able to constitute themselves as journalists who were taking on the RCMP. So ironically, one week I would be on the cover branded as a cop hater, with quotes from cops about how my work on defunding was destabilizing society and I'm crazy, and this kind of language would be used. And the very next week, they could publish an expose on the RCMP and be hailed as great journalists. So the very thing that Black and Indigenous women are constantly doing, which is critiquing the police as liars, as corrupt, and as harmful, rendered me surveillable and rendered me unprotectable. And then those same people could turn around and constitute themselves as great journalists at the very end of their career, and then were hailed when they went belly up as like, oh, this is too bad. Like, they did such great work. So that's story A. And of course, that instituted in me practices of self-surveillance. I don't have social media for a reason. I'm not on Instagram, I'm not on Twitter. I no longer use any social media because of that practice of being watched and self-protection. I couldn't walk certain places. Every event I did, I was conscious. I was always worried that I have a student in my class that would take my recorded lectures during COVID and would sell them to Frank, or, clip a section out. And I actually had experiences, and this ties it to the discussion of the Academy, where, for example, I would have a guest speaker who might speak about something like Palestinian rights, and I would remove the video under the fear that this would get me criminalized within the school, this would be hauled up, and I would be put in right-wing media. So this also instituted practices of self-surveillance upon myself, which I'm sure are very common to those who are listening who have experienced this. Another experience I had, and now within the Black community, and we know Black women are also heavily policed and surveyed within our communities as well, was that following encampment clearing in Halifax, which I know happened other places as well, a Black cop put a picture of himself online, posed in front of the shelter that they were destroying. And I pointed out how this Black cop had a long history of violence against women, and that he was proud of his violence by posting this picture of himself in front of the shelter of an unhoused person. His father began harassing me, and then I was literally followed on the street. Like, someone ran up on me. I was walking on the street to scream at me about criticizing this police officer publicly. And that officer actually tried to get me removed from the defunding report on the basis that, I hate cops and I'm telling the truth about his violence and also his history of domestic abuse. And of course, again, this was within the community now. I experienced literally being attacked on the street for merely speaking about this man who has harmed generations of Black women himself. Turn to the academic sphere, and we've had a great discussion of that. Just a small story. Actually, today, while I was teaching, I got a call from HR. And I'm internally panicking the entire rest of my class. Why is HR calling me? I called them back the minute I got off teaching, no response. And I'm like, did someone complain about me? Did a student say I hate white people? My course is about Canada. Are people offending? You go through all of that. And then I'm like, oh yeah, I'm on the benefits user committee. Like, they're probably calling me to book a meeting, But that moment of, and this is expressed so well in the previous talk, that all the ways that our students can survey us, can complain about us, so that in the classroom, we are constantly watching ourselves and constantly always feeling on the verge of this complaint or this removal or having to defend ourselves. So when I saw HR called me, I immediately jumped to this place of what happened, who complained about me, am I going to be removed from my job, do I have to get legal rep? And I moved into that cycle already. During my academic research, I'm currently researching police animals, and I'm convinced that we know dog bites are on Indigenous and Black people. So I'm looking at police animals and their use in state violence. And I've been trying to get data. So I've been asking for I've been doing a bunch of ATIPs to the RCMP, which they keep rejecting or modifying or pretending not to understand. So you have to constantly go through a process of resubmitting. And they recently asked for my ID. And I was like, can you clarify why you need this? These aren't personal records, these are public records. And then they said, okay, never mind. But clearly they were trying to counter survey me and frighten me by saying, if you continue to ask this race-based data, then we're going to try and survey you, and you will be watched for trying to watch us. And we also know that these kind of practices come back to us from the state. And finally, Idil and I have talked quite frequently, particularly in our podcast that we were doing, No Life Left Behind, about our experiences as Black women entering prisons in the organizing work that we do and in the friendship and love and care work that we do, where we are viewed as always a disruptive influence and as a suspicious one. So we are inherently sex workers according to the prison. Like, we must be somehow selling something to the men, because it's not possible that we could have a mutual organizing relationship, or we must be bringing in contraband, or we must be otherwise suspicious. And so these practices where we're doing care work that the state does not do, and of course the state is counter to, and then that leads to these surveillances such as, why are you on the PIN numbers of so many men? Why are multiple men giving you calls? Are you having sex with all of them? Are you bringing them drugs? So all of these kind of questions when you enter a prison, and you can't wear perfume and your hair is policed. So all these things, especially if you're a young Black woman, are then seen as your body out of place in the prison, and you become policed under the assumption that you're bringing a kind of inappropriate intimacy into that space. So those are a few ways that I experienced surveillance. I also wanted to move out to some larger cases. I know I'm probably talking too long. I'll be like 5 minutes already. So people may be familiar with the case of Santina Rayo. This is a Black mother in Halifax. So this happened a couple of years ago, where she was shopping at Walmart with her 2 children. And it was the first time she had left her home in a while, because she had just left a domestic violence situation and been unable to leave her house. So she went to Walmart with her young children and actually called her mother and said, was talking to her mother through the aisles and saying, I've been able to get out of the house, and I'm so proud of myself that I'm here. Somebody said that she was talking loudly and aggressively on her phone, and they called store security, who then subsequently accused her of stealing. So they said that because she was moving through the aisles of the stroller and placing things on top of the stroller, that she must be stealing from the store. They not only called store security, but the police come into Walmart. And here we see the kind of relations on property that Ronaldo Walcott has talked about in his book, that the protection of capitalist property here. So the police are coming into a Walmart to police a woman so-called accused of stealing, which is precipitated by the fact that she's perceived to have a loud voice. So you see all of this surveillance working. She is beaten to the ground in front of her young children, put in handcuffs and arrested. And eventually, while she has a concussion, lacerations, broken bones, she is charged with resisting arrest and assaulting the officer. All of that to say that there is a CERT report, which is our version of the SIU into the incident. It is only 5 pages long, and I recommend this report for really encapsulating the kinds of surveillances we are talking about, where Santina herself is never interviewed. So her account of what she was doing, I was moving through the aisles to get toys. I had placed the lemons in the stroller. These kind of things, I showed them my receipt when they approached me. It was only when they started asking me for my address that I became curious and resisted. So these kinds of statements from her have no place in the report, and she's not even interviewed. But her voice makes it into the report by being this loud, aggressive, threatening voice. And they claim that the reason why the police had to approach her was not solely because she was so-called shoplifting, but because they feared for the safety of her children because of how loud her voice was. So we can see here all the stereotypes of unfit motherhood, loud, angry Black womanness, the confluence of store security and policing, all taking place within a Walmart, which also locks Black hair products up behind the counter. So I could go on about that case, but I put a pin in that. I also can talk about housing surveillance, and this really matches with Idil's work on child welfare and the various forms of how these state so-called care systems of so-called assistance are a gateway to criminalization for Black women. A friend of mine who is a single mother living in a precarious housing situation is experiencing her neighbors, for example, accusing her of not paying utilities. And every time she pays them, they claim that she doesn't pay them. And even when she shows receipts, the landlords believe the other neighbor over her and accuse her of not paying her bills. This has led to escalations such as installing a security camera outside of her door. So now she cannot move in and out of her own residence without being watched. This has included them, of course, accusing her of having men in the house, another iteration of the "you must be a sex worker." And in fact, when a male friend of ours, Desmond Cole, called to try and, defend her and advocate for her, this became another piece in the "you have men around you" puzzle, which of course renders her as a problem within housing. So we know that Black women within housing, particularly single mothers, are policed in all these ways, from being accused of, sex work, from being accused of smoking weed, from the way that you raise your children being policed, so that the housing system itself, and particularly for those living in government housing, which can move you around, control your movement, control what business you have in the home, which is of course very connected to these systems of child welfare as well. Child welfare, as Dr. Abdillahi has told us so comprehensively, is a major site of surveillance and policing for Black women in particular. So they can enter your house without a warrant. They can question about a man in your life, your sexual behavior. What food do you have in your fridge? Is your baby lying down enough? And all of these, of course, intersect with narratives of bad motherhood as well. So these are all places that we experience surveillance beyond our conception of policing in the States that are also specifically gendered. And just to finish off, I would suggest that appearance is also a site of surveillance. Everything from hair, but also skin shade and stuff like that is particularly put upon women. So women are often seen as the gateway through which the Black community as a whole is policed, whether that's through motherhood, through our disrespectful behavior, through our appearance in community, through how we present ourselves. We're often on the front lines at these government jobs, in the civil service, in particular jobs, retail, all these places that Black women in many ways serve as the front lines that produce surveillance upon the community and are expected as a result to gatekeep the community by refusing to speak about abuse or incest or domestic violence or the issues we experience within the community. And we know that when we speak out, we are criminalized and surveyed by our own communities in a particular way. An experience that I went through the last couple of years when I spoke out about a powerful man, and then, found myself literally threatened within community, and people were able to write things like, "She should be burned out of the community," with no pushback or criticism. So I also want us to think about how particularly Black women's expected silences and secret keeping that is demanded from us is a very deep form of surveillance that is part of a very violent continuum that Black women live within our communities, and that notion of policing and surveillance that's put on us, and often, of course, taught to us from other women in our community as well, that in order to be a good woman, you don't speak about abuse in your home. As my grandmother would have said, "Remember, you're a lady," which also meant silence. As my mother would say, "Don't wash your laundry." All of these things that we're taught that I think particularly devolve on women. And I think we're almost out of time. So the final thing I'll just say is, of course, gender itself is a surveillance and policing, the monitoring of trans and queer bodies, the assumption of femininity, which belongs to white women, and our inability to fit our bodies, our behaviors, our lives into that mold. And of course, Black women who have constantly been rendered as male, masculinized, defeminized. Also, therefore, that surveillance connects to the surveillance that trans people experience, that queer people experience. So we also have to recognize that the very notion of a heterosexual cis female body is a production of racial surveillance and gendered surveillance as well. So as we go forward speaking about the impacts on Black women, that very construction, of course, is part of the way that our bodies are regulated as well. So I think with that, we're probably deeply out of time. So I will pause there. Idil, one final thing I also wanted to say about visibility beyond the data. So we often in Canada try to make ourselves visible by requesting data, a process I'm also involved in. But I want us to think, as Idil pushes us to do, about how our Black lives and the visibility of those lives and the presence of those lives is not merely scoped by the notion of disaggregated racial data, which becomes like our policy call for everything. And we need a much richer engagement with our being and presence. And these kind of offerings that Idil is pushing us towards through her theoretical work and her praxis, I think are really important in moving our conversation in Black Canada about Black women beyond the idea that we simply need data to prove that Black women exist, which is in itself a surveillance form, and that we can think much more broadly about our lives in community, our lives with each other, our collective lives as women with each other, learning and being with each other, that go far beyond these kind of state-sponsored or state accepted modes of being as well. And I will close there after promising to close 10 times. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Al. There was so much that was said there. I'm going to actually let Professor Beverly Bain go next, and then we can hopefully come back to a broader discussion amongst panelists and with the participants as well. So I'd now like to introduce our third and final speaker for this evening, Professor Beverly Bain, who's a Black, queer feminist, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist scholar. She teaches in Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies in the Department of Historical Studies at the University of Toronto, Mississauga campus. She currently teaches and researches in the area of Caribbean and Black diasporic sexualities, Black and Caribbean queer feminist organizing, sexual assault, and violence against women, gender, colonialism, transnationalism, and anti-capitalism. Bev Bain is the author of Fire, Passion, and Politics, the creation of Blockorama as a Black queer diasporic space in Toronto Pride Festival, in the book We Still Demand Defining Resistance and Sex and Gender Struggles, in the edited book by Gentile, Kingsman, and Rankin. Bain is also currently working on a series of essays on Black radical feminist queer organizing in Toronto from the 80s to the present. And I would now like to welcome Beverly Bain to the conversation. Bev, I'm going to need you to unmute the microphone. Thank you and welcome.
I'm so sorry. I thought I got unmuted automatically. Me and technology. I'm going to start again. Thank you, Idil. Thank you to the School of Disability Studies and to this esteemed panel comprised of Elle and Camisha, who did a tremendous job in terms of making the links to gender, sexuality, surveillance, Black women's lives, the ASL interpreters, closed captioners, and other present. I'm truly honored to be present, to think and engage with all of you and others in what is clearly a timely, necessary, and urgent and generative conversation, which is Policing Ecologies, Lessons from the Plantations, part of the Black Oculars series. So thank you, all of you. I am going to be brief in terms of what I'm going to say, because I think so much has been said. I also think that what is most critical here is for us to have an engaged conversation. But the focus that I want to give this, and the focus I'm giving this, is that I am focusing on Regis Kosinski Paquette's death in the presence of police. And I'm doing that within the context because I was thinking a lot about policing ecologies, Black ecologies. What does that mean in this context, in the context of Black women's lives, in terms of the lives of women like Regis Kosinski Paquette and her life and the relationship, to the ongoing afterlife of slavery within the context of plantations logic, as well as the ongoing surveillance and ongoing violence against women by police in the context of women who actually, Black women who actually live in Ontario housing complexes and or who actually experience ongoing police surveillance and management in multiple ways. I call this, I titled this paper, They Say She Jumped. We say she was trapped by police and fighting for her life. The suspicious death of Regis Kosinski Paquette. We were told to stand outside, and that's what we did. All we know was our daughter went in one door and didn't come out the same door. These are the words of Claudette Beals Clayton, mother of Regis Koshinsky Paquette, the 24-year-old Afro-Indigenous woman who fell to her death in the presence of Toronto Police Services officers after they arrived on the scene. According to the family, around 5 p.m. on the 27th of May, 2020, a 911 call was made by Claudette Beals Clayton, concerned for the safety and well-being of a child, Regis. She said Regis was in distress over a family conflict, and her mother sought police assistance to bring calm to the situation. After approximately 1 to 2 minutes, the mother and the brother heard commotion in the apartment, followed by Regis crying out, "Mom, help, mom, help, mom, help," before everything went silent. I begin with the story of Regis's death because much of Black women's encounter with police have been left out of the narratives and research on police brutality and killing of Black people. And we heard both Elle and Camisha spoke to this. This is not to say that Black feminist writers have not been confronting and documenting the erasures of Black women's lives in Canada for decades. Dion Brand, Linda Carty, Peggy Bristow, and others throughout the decades have documented Black women's history and experiences of gendered racist oppression by state institutions. So this has been documented, and this documentation has been taking place for a while, yet it disappears in the narratives on policing on police intervention and police brutality of Black people in this in the city and in the narratives in the media, etc. As far back as 1989, a group of us, including Sharona Hall, who has passed on, formed the Women's Coalition Against Racism and Police Violence to organize in defense of Sophia Cook, a young Black woman shot by police. Sophia Cook did survive, but with physical injuries. She was at the time in a car with other Black men. She had taken a lift, and police stopped the vehicle and immediately opened fire. She was lucky, to be alive. Nevertheless, what that indicated is the way that Black women are always, or are produced and located in ways that are at risk in the context of policing. Black women's lives were imperiled sexually and physically during slavery through methods of surveillance, beatings, and other forms of management. Angela Davis stated, as females, slave women were inherently vulnerable to all forms of sexual coercion. If the most violent punishments of men consisted in floggings and mutilations, women were flogged and mutilated as well as raped. So the ongoing brutality and killing of Black men and women by police continue in what Saidiya Hartman describes as living in the afterlife of slavery, and Christina Sharp in the wake of slavery. Sharp writes, living in the wake of slavery is living the afterlife of property and living the afterlife in which the Black child inherits the non-status, the non-being of the mother. That inheritance of a non-status is everywhere, apparent now in the ongoing criminalization of Black women and children. And we heard Camisha talk extensively about, that prison to, school to prison pipeline and the role of youths and of young people. It is critical to note here that Regis and her mother, who are Afro-Indigenous, have been living in OHC housing with their family. Visibly Black and Indigenous and living in OHC means that your everyday life and movements are managed through surveillance and other forms of state interventions, as Elle has talked extensively about this. Idil Abdillahi, in her forthcoming book, Black Women and the State, Surveillance, Poverty, and the Violence of Social Assistance, a brilliant book, which must be read if people really care about Black people's lives, Black women's lives. It is critical that this book be read. That the Ontario Works program, despite not naming Black people as its targets, function to keep Black people and Black women, especially at the center of state apparatuses of control and dehumanization. And we again heard from Elle in terms of her discussion around the dehumanization of Santino Rajo, right? And the ongoing experiences that she herself has experienced through surveillance and policing, and the ongoing experiences of Camisha. So we see that, how all of this intersects and interlocks together. It is critical for us to point to the role that policing has played and continue to play in the lives of Black women. Police have always regulated the mobility of Black people, as we have seen in carding and with respect to Black women. Surveillance and harassment of Black women was and continues to be used against us as a tool of racial, sexual, and gendered terror. In 1993, a Black Jamaican woman, Audrey Smith, who was visiting relatives in Toronto in 1993, was standing on a Parkdale street corner, and she was approached by two police officers who aggressively strip searched her on the street in view of passerbys because she looked like a drug dealer and a prostitute. And again, we heard that Black women in public space are always deemed dangerous, dangerous as drug dealers or as prostitutes. Maynard in Policing Black Lives tell us that Black women are positioned as drug mules and prostitutes in public spaces that subject them to racist, gendered, physical, and sexual violence in those spaces, as well as behind closed doors. When 911 was called, 7 police officers showed up and followed Koshinsky Paquette into her apartment as she went to pee. They refused to allow any family member to enter with them, preventing anyone from witnessing their interaction with her. Family members heard rumblings, followed by her call for help, then dead silence. Both Andrea Ritchie and Maynard in their works have shown that the violence Black women experience at the hands of police often take place in their homes, on street corners, and laneways at night, where such violence is concealed from public view. Both McKittrick and Catherine McKittrick and Ronaldo Walcott reminds us that we are still living in this context of the plantation, with all its logics of surveillance, police brutality, and destruction of Black life that marked the period of enslavement. Ronaldo writes, the plantation isn't, as so many of us Black and otherwise think, or at least wish to believe, a thing of the past. Rather, the plantation persists as a large unseen superstructure, shaping modern everyday life and many of its practices, attitudes, and assumptions, even if some of these have been over time transformed. So we see that, what Koshinsky was actually experiencing in the context of her mother and her family was within that, was immersed within surveillance, the plantation logics of control and management, but of violence, and also, the ongoing lack of transparency that often comes with that, that actually leads to the demise of the individual, sometimes in public view, sometimes in private. The plantation, with its logic of capitalism, Black dispossession, anti-Black violence, is also a place of Black resistance and Black refusal. We could imagine that Regis Kosinski Paquette resisted the violent, racist, gendered encounter with the police in her apartment. It is also realistic to say that she feared they would harm her because she called out for her mother. Why so many police in an apartment with her alone? Would she have been alive today if it was not for the corralling of her in the apartment as a cage animal? They say she jumped, but I choose to believe she was trapped by police in fear while fighting to save her life. After all, her shriek, "Mama, help me," was heard by her family outside the apartment door. The kind of painful, desperate yell that signals imminent death, as that released by George Floyd, as his breath was violently squeezed out of his body for the world to watch over and over and over again. Christina Sharp says, Black people everywhere and anywhere we are still produce into, and through the wake, an insistence on existing versus Black being in the wake. The Black uprising that occurred after George Floyd and Regis's death, demanding the defunding and abolition globally and across Canada, is testament to the refusal of Black people, of Black women, to exist, to breed, and to live. We will continue to say her name, Regis Kosinski Paquette. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Bain. Such a great historical framing, and also reminding us of the continued disappearance of Black women's not only experiences, their contributions in terms of social and political interventions, research, the academy, so forth. One of the things that was really pivotal for me was the way that you highlighted that fear in fact kills us. The experience of surveillance kills us, and the fear of that as well. And so thank you so much for that. I'd like to go ahead and open up the discussion. So I'd like to welcome participants to start asking questions. If there are any questions, if there aren't questions in the chat already, I see there are a few questions in the chat. So I will maybe, Tally, if I can invite you to maybe just read aloud the questions, and I'm also going to point participants to the chat as well for you to have a quick review of the questions.
Okay, so the questions are all in the Q&A function. Would you like us to keep only the Q&A function open, or would you like the chat open for questions now at this time too?
Let's go ahead and use the Q&A function. Thank you so much, Tally.
No problem. Okay, so the first question is from Anonymous, and it says, what do you think about the ways that accountability can be minimized within Black communities, and to a different degree, other communities that experience broader surveillance from white supremacist society / culture through the threat and fear of, quote, white people are watching, end quote. What does this do?
I'll start with that. Thank you for that question. I'm sure everybody else can jump in. I'll try and be brief, but yeah, so this has been a particular construct that only, of course, goes one way. So is typically used particularly against radical Black people or those perceived not to fit the kind of respectable like polity of Black people. But particularly politically radical Black people who want to engage in critique of powerful Black people are usually told that we are not supposed to do this. It's not the time and place. We've chosen the wrong venue. We've said the wrong thing in the wrong way to the wrong people because white people are watching us, and therefore we have an obligation to the unity of the community. Now, of course, that never goes towards us. So when people want to critique us, they can do so freely and in fact, morally. And there is never the, oh, well, we can't critique the radical Black person. So we saw all kinds of critiques of, like Black people in the, like doing the movement for Black lives, right? And they don't speak for us. People could freely say this kind of thing. But we are not allowed to say, criticize a Black cabinet minister or a Black MP under this notion. So the first thing I want to say is that is a fictional construct that is then used to justify a concentration of elite power in the Black community and silence the voices, particularly of those who would challenge that power. It's also traditionally obviously been a very gendered frame because it's meant to shut women up largely, right? That we cannot speak about violence. We cannot speak about, the things that happen in our homes, the things that happen in our families, in our communities. Legitimately, white supremacy is a thing. The police are watching, our communities are, but this is our silence therefore becomes this kind of supposed protective veil for our community, which of course it isn't, but is largely used to then silence the narratives of Black women. So I think that begins with the problematic construct of the very notion of Black community and how it's deployed, as opposed to a Black collectivity or a Black solidarity, which are things we were trying to build. Community is very frequently used by elite Black people who have adjacency and wish proximity to white power, who are able to wield this notion of community in order to get to the so-called table, right? So I speak for the Black community, so you need to give me a grant. I speak for the Black community, so I should sit with the prime minister, right? So they are able to use this idea, which then they have to forcibly police the rest of us and survey our commentary in order to suppress our critique so that they can legitimize themselves in that very same white gaze that they will then claim is the reason why we have to shut the hell up. So that's my commentary. Others can add to that.
Can I maybe invite Camisha or Bev? Would either of you like to respond?
Bev, go ahead. If Bev
Oh, you
would
want
like
me
to.
to? Okay. Um, I'm not quite clear about the question. Are we asking here, because it says, what do you think about the ways that accountability can be minimized within Black communities, and to a different degree, other communities that experience broader surveillance? And I mean, when I think about accountability can be minimized, I mean, the reality is that when we're talking about surveillance, and we're talking about surveillance from the state, and we're talking about surveillance from the white supremacists and white supremacy in white state, it is there. We are not the ones who need to be accountable. If anything, it is accountability is something that does not exist, not from police. I mean, in terms of when we think about, and I'm going to go back to situations like we just Koshinsky Parket, when we think about the situation of Rahul and other women, there has been no accountability. There's been no transparency. All of these things happen silently, and in fact, they're investigated by the Special Investigative Unit because police are involved, and the Special Investigative Unit is only accountable to the police. In fact, one of the biggest arguments that we've had in, for decades now, I mean, as long as I've been an activist and an organizer for over 40 years, is that the SIU, which came into existence following, Andrew, following Johnson's killing, is that it does not, that it was incredibly ineffective and should not exist. Today, we are still saying such oversight should not exist because it does not provide protection. In fact, it's another arm of surveillance, and it's one that actually protects the privacy and security of police while actually turning its information and data collection on those of us who are the ones that have been victimized. So I think it's really important when we talk about, when we talk about, speaking to, accountability and its minimization, is that accountability must go hand in hand with the way in which state apparatus and surveillance apparatus are actually deployed against, Black women in particular, against non-gender conforming people, trans women, who actually experience very much the ongoing, and particularly those who are Black and Indigenous, the ongoing surveillance and the ongoing brutal, attacks from police, and also from their methods of surveillance. There are multiple forms of surveillance methods. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, I too was having some issue with the way the question was worded, so it was difficult for me. But I do think that there is some accountability needed for those who are again policing us within, right? And so, and it's about understanding what the cultural imperialism is doing to us, and what we then are doing to each other. It's about us being, it's about really control and us being well behaved, right? That's when we talk about white people are watching, we need to be well behaved, right? And I think that, we can be cognizant of the fact that white people are watching because they're always watching. It's how do we control what they see, and what they see shouldn't reinforce the cultural imperialism. It should really be an affirmation of Black life, right? And so I think we have to be cognizant of the surveillance. Yes, we are always under the gaze. I don't know that at this point we are able to avert the gaze, but what we need to be responsible in a different way with how it is that we are performing under the gaze in a way that is life sustaining and Black life promoting, rather than affirming other realities.
I just want to add, and thank you for that, Camisha and Elle. I just want to add that I do think that one of the ways, and I think we need to see what a lot, you yourselves in your examples have also given, have also informed us about the ways that you have responded to the gaze, right? We have multiple ways of responding to the gaze. I don't believe that our priority is about what white people think. I don't think that that's, in fact, and maybe because I've been doing this work for so long, I don't give a damn about what white people think. I don't give a damn about what respectable Black people think, right? I think what is critical and what is important in this time is how do we actually work against those kinds of logics that exist within us, that continue to persist. How do we confront them? Because I think it's about confronting and refusing very bluntly and very openly at different points. I don't think that it is about necessarily being too concerned about how we navigate or how we dodge, but very much confronting, because that gaze will be there. Those surveillance techniques and methods are there. But our struggle requires us, to take risk. And taking risk means that we will be watched. Taking risk means that we will be sought after. Surely there has to be ways in which we create ways to keep ourselves safe. And that is a collective struggle as far as I'm concerned. That's the kind of collective struggle that we do to watch for each other. As Christina Sharp says, that this is part of the kind of work that we do. It's about care. It's about the way that we care for each other through this process, the way that we support each other. We talk about Sus Velas and we have seen how Black young activists have used different ways to undermine the gaze by turning their cell phones back on, on the bigger machinery, right? So what have they come back with is a call for body cams, right? So that they then can use that as a way to say that they are being accountable, but what they are actually doing is arming themselves with very direct, open forms of surveillance machinery against us. But we also know that that body cam does not tell the story of what's going on or the truth. So that does not and should not scare us. We need to continue, to resist and to refuse, the mechanisms, but we have to do it also, boldly and with conviction.
And thank you, Bill. I was going to add to that too, that a great example that you brought to mind is the way that people speak on monitored prison phone calls. So those calls are monitored, obviously, to survey our relationships and intimacy, but also, of course, to gather evidence. And so since people are listening, people often use those calls to say things like, if you're listening, Crown, like you're a racist bitch or whatever, like knowing that the police are listening and actually taking it as an avenue. Like, by the way, you wrongfully convict people all the time. Or if a guard's listening in, you guys need to stop calling. So people actually start to use the monitoring system in order to say things. Somebody once called me and spent a good 2 hours speaking back to the police because they're like, I know this call is monitored, they're accusing me of being in a gang. So also the idea that people will often use this monitoring in this particular way to therefore resist and turn, as you say, turn the surveillance against people. At the same time, we often very ironically highlight that in calls, and I'll be like, in case anyone's listening, I am not a lawyer and not giving legal advice, so don't try to pretend that I am, So also using these kind of spaces to highlight the surveillance and say, we know what you're doing. We know you're trying to listen to this call and that you're trying to catch us out. So know that we know. And we're also mocking you for it. And we're also going to continue to live our Black lives on this phone and communicate with each other. And you are not going to stop us from doing that. And just try to use this as evidence because we're going to corrupt that. So also these ways that we are able to turn back on that mechanism. I think that's very rich. And thank you, Bev, for raising that.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to add to that and say that, I mean, again, because the gaze is a constant, we can either shrink under the gaze or we can live, right? And so because I've found ways to really grow into my subversion under the gaze, right? And I think, again, it can be a little classist, right? Because we need opportunities to be seen in certain ways, and status does afford you some of those things. So it's sometimes it's hard to say, well, I don't really care about the gaze, but I think that our survival, a key to our survival, is actually living under the gaze and not shrinking under it.
Thank you so much for that last comment, Camisha, Bev, and Al. I want to move us forward to some of the other questions. There's some really thoughtful and interesting questions in the chat. So again, I thank the participants. Tali, I'm going to invite you to read the next question if you'd like to go ahead and do that.
Sure, of course. So the next question is also anonymous, and it says, first and foremost, thank you for such wonderful presentations. It truly has been a privilege to be here. As a sex work historian, I was wondering if some of the panelists could speak further on the intersections and implications therein of patriarchy, settler patriarchy, racism, and whorephobia as it relates to the policing and surveillance of Black women and femme persons. I firmly believe sex work isn't necessarily the problem, but the issues and isms I just mentioned, especially as they relate to respectability politics. Thank you.
So maybe I'll, Bev, I don't know if you're unmuted because you wanted to speak, but I was going to.
No, I'll mute.
Okay, so maybe I'll invite Camisha or Al, whichever one of you want to begin with responding to that question.
I guess I'll take a shot. I think the first thing is it's really important, your intervention, to point out that it isn't that there's anything wrong with sex work, but the sex work isn't the problem itself. It's, of course, the narrative attached to that. So that when we speak about, being deemed sex workers, it wouldn't be wrong if we were sex workers. If I wanted to sex work with men in the prison, like what would actually be wrong with that, right? But so I think that's an important point to raise, that it wouldn't actually, it's not, the problem isn't that we're not actually sex workers and people are calling us sex workers. The problem is that the very notion that sex work itself is seen as disorderly and disruptive, and therefore bringing necessary of surveillance because of a contamination narrative, because of a respectability narrative, because the way that sex work is seen to violate the patriarchal white nuclear family in particular, that sex workers, they take men away from their wives, so these kind of narratives that go to the heart of how the nation state also polices and regulates sexuality, right? And this is why sex work is so dangerous to the state, because that idea that, people can claim it for themselves, do work for themselves, and that it's not monitored either by the family and patriarchal relations or by these kind of legalistic state-based relations. But yeah, what was the second part of the question? It was a very rich question. I guess I kind of answered it, right? That sex work is a challenge to the patriarchal control of bodies, so that, of course, Black women are commodified under white settler patriarchy. We are literally always exchanged and always property, but then always accused of commodifying ourselves, right? So it's okay to commodify us, but should we want to exchange our bodies and we're always accused of doing so, then now it's a problem, right? So it's this irony at the heart of how Black women are controlled in all these ways. Our reproduction is controlled by the state. This is a heart of how a white nation state constitutes itself. And then, of course, ironically accuses us of violating that. But the reason for that threat is, of course, because yes, the control of sex and who has it and who has it with what has always been at the heart of this white patriarchal settler project, right? It is inherently a project of the white family and how that is constituted as a violent space, right? That excludes all others. So I guess that's the kind of stab I took at that. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you so much for that. Bev, would you like to add to that as
Yes.
well?
Yes, thank you for that, Elle. Yeah, I want to add, I want to say, in terms of when we think about, women and sex work, we also have to think about the way in which, women's bodies and Black women's bodies and trans bodies, are configured in public space or in, brothels. I mean, and these are different sort of places in which sex work exists, right? And the way in which, police those spaces of sex workers. We know the way that public space is designed a space that is controlled, by the state, by patriarchal elements, by surveillance and management, so that sex workers in those spaces are managed and controlled in particular kinds of ways, right? Their bodies are seen, and let's be clear that all sex workers do not experience the same kind of violence, even though overall it is a space where violence happens. Not all sex workers are predisposed to the same level of violence within those spaces. Black trans sex workers are racialized, and Indigenous trans sex workers, and Black trans sex workers and Black sex workers tend to actually encounter way more violence, not just from Johns, but from police in those spaces, right? Police regulate public space, regulate places where sex workers are located in those spaces. I remember when I did my study on sexual assault and police investigations of sexual assault, I interviewed sex workers, Indigenous and Black and racialized sex workers and trans workers. And they indicated the way in which their bodies in those spaces are managed, policed, and violated. And in fact, they actually would resist, filing complaints against their Johns, not only because at the time they would be actually arrested for solicitation, but more so that they would have, it's the kind of violence that they would encounter from the police. Right? That they would literally avoid having that kind of encounter if they can. Police rape sexually assault, violently beat, and coerce sex workers in those spaces. So we see the connection of patriarchy and settler colonialism, because space and place becomes that which is designated, that which is white owned, respectability, marked by respectability for certain people, and marked by disposability for others, and those being Black and Indigenous people. But as we talk about these things, I always want us to keep at the center the way in which Black and racialized and Indigenous people resist and refuse those kinds of mechanisms, the way in which they carve out safety protocols and mechanism, collective kinds of responses for themselves in those kinds of spaces, right? It's always important for us to recognize that with these interlocking, intersecting structures of patriarchy, settler colonialism, racism, queerphobia, transphobia, anti-Blackness, misogyny, that, that there is always a way in which these particular individuals carve out safety collective processes for themselves in that space, in owning that space, in reshaping that space in order to allow them to be in that space safe. So I'll just say that.
Thank you so much for those last comments, Bev. I'm just looking at the time, and I want to just take one more maybe quick question and have folks just be mindful of the time, which I think it's a really good connection to your last point. And so this question is from guest Rochelle. And the question is as follows: considering surveillance and erasure of Black women, what are the strategies you personally use to more than survive, but to thrive? So maybe we can begin with Camisha, Elle, and then Bev. Thank you.
So I'm still on the last question. I won't answer it, but I'm thinking deeply about it, but I don't want to take up any time on it. I take a little bit of a different position on that. But it's connected to, I guess, selling self and selling out and being real, right? And so the way that I care for myself is through affirming the ways that I exist without in my authenticity, right? And so it's really about reminders about the ways in which whiteness impacts me and sort of the things that I take for granted, and really trying to subvert in all the ways that I can, because it is for me it is a question of well-being. It is a question of there's this duplicity, right? And I need to be able to keep both selves well, and so really being able to strengthen the parts of myself that aren't popularly or readily palatable is part of the way that I take care of myself and survive, because my survival really is around creating with my being, creating the conditions that allow other people to survive, that allow other Black women and Black people to survive, right? And I know that, again, the personal is political. I know that everything I do either is is either sort of fortifying Black life or negating it, right? And so keeping that at the forefront and living my truth is part of how I survive.
Thank you. I guess this also is the other question. Sorry, I'm also trying to type answers to the questions so that people get some kind of answer. So sorry if I'm like, as I'm trying to also listen and type at the same time. The last question also ties into this, which is also what do you do to cultivate joy, I guess. So how do we survive? I mean, friendship and solidarity, I think is the big thing. I guess if I want to plug my book a bit, like this is what it's about also, like the intimate love and resistance and care that takes place at all of these sites and the great joy and human emotion and feeling and that we share as we do this work. I often say that it's not the work itself that I find tiring in any way. It can be obviously despairing. There's a lot of things, you know, this terrible work that we do, but I never find that to be the source of exhaustion, because every moment that we are fighting that is a moment of significance for all of us, you know, as we do that work. I find what happens around it, you know, the kind of discourse you get, these kind of surveillances, you know, people dragging you on Twitter or, you know, having a white supremacist rag come, that is tiring. But I don't find the work itself. I think the work itself does cultivate care in us because it is care work that we share together. And as we learn how to do that together and learn how to find our capacities and significance and share that with others and find our ability to liberate together and learn from each other in that, I think it's a very beautiful thing. It's a difficult thing, but I don't find that in that sense of sacrifice. Obviously in terms of, the questions of what do you do to survive? I mean, I don't know, I just joined this hardcore like running team, you know, and then we go and work out at like 6 a.m. and everybody's confused because they know me in one way and sometimes they recognize me, which is no form, they're like, who are you? But don't imagine that I would be like running around the streets at 6 a.m. Aren't I like the angry Black woman that screams about white people and cops on the news? And I also run, you know? So I think also that says something though, that, you know, we are allowed to be in our many ways. We're allowed to find joy in whatever ways and not be contained to what we're perceived to have to do or what our interests or lives is supposed to be. And we're allowed to do whatever we want. And in my case, like, I find running an act of freedom. I get to move freely across, like, you know, land in ways that other people don't get to do. And it's something I do for myself within my body. So that's important to me. But I think just finding those kind of spaces where we can be. And, you know, some ways it's like not a mystery, you know, I don't know, play on my phone. I watch stupid TikTok videos, you know, like we can always take that space away and like not have that. I think it's also important for activists not to constantly be self-surveying ourselves around like, I'm not working hard enough, I could be doing more, I feel guilty. Like we have to reflect all the time, but we also have to learn to have grace with ourselves as well and grace with those around us and not be policing constantly each other as well, so that those spaces become spaces we can no longer share in or love in and trust in because we're so busy policing things. So I think cultivating grace for ourselves and others, for those we love, giving each other the benefit of the doubt. And then I think just unconditional love and care is what brings, you know, the most. I am loved by people and they love me back and I love them. And that is what I think we wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't love work. And that is what I think is the most cultivating thing. So.
Bev, do you want to go ahead and give?
I'll just say briefly, you know, I mean, my the way I take care of myself is that I work against empire. I work against colonialism. I work against, I do not see myself as part of the institution that I work for. I constantly work against. I see myself as it's a job, and I constantly see my role in that is not of the university, but of against the university, of against the system. My joy comes from being in community with, you know, radical Black folks and Black feminists and Indigenous and racialized people. My joy comes from conversations, from thinking of ways in which to imagine a different world and imagine that world together. That's where I find solace. That's where I continue to work from. And that's where I get my joy. And of course, we have personal ways we take care of ourselves. And when we talk about, you know, how we handle surveillance and erasure, I mean, you know, for being an activist for 40-something years, I don't know that I would have survived if it wasn't for collective organizing and community. and you know, a constant, you know, imagining and reimagining of something very different, in which we can all look forward to and work towards. So yes, that's how I stay. That's how I stay alive. That's how I live, and that's you know, how I find solace. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Bev. I'm just going to really quickly steal a few more moments of the audience's time. If you need to log off, please do go ahead and feel free to do so. But on the note of plugs and a few things on your book, Al, I found this passage that I actually shared with one of my students earlier today. So I actually think it's a really good way to end. So Elle writes in her new text, Abolitionist Intimacies, out this November. She writes, "We don't hold anything back in this work. Not savings, not our tongues that get us labeled as troublemakers, not even our tears, although we push them back and get up the next morning to keep fighting on. Because someone has to buy the groceries, put the clothes in the prison box, pay the gas for the visits. Somebody has to hold the hands in court and call the lawyer and visit the jail and take the call from the suicide cell." And then I'm going to skip a little bit. She goes on to say, "Sometimes I lie in bed and think about the books I could have written, the papers I could have published, the poems and articles and chapters that I didn't give my time to. And everyone tells me I wouldn't be lying here if I had just written those things. But then I ask myself, which life would I exchange for that book? Whose life was worth less than a chapter? And I know I wouldn't choose differently. Just as nobody would choose differently, not if you knew the life that was in front of you, that you had the power to sustain and hold." And so with that, I think—
Beautiful, beautiful. That's absolutely beautiful. I'm really looking forward to reading the book.
Absolutely. So again,
Beautiful.
I just want to thank our panelists this evening, Professors Bain, Sibblis, and Jones, as well as our audience, the organizers, for their participation. I want to remind everybody that we do have another session on October the 20th, same time, same channel, with speaker Dr. Tricia Hilton and the Black Deaf Canada research team, including Dr. Janelle Russi